Dhoruba Bin Wahad. Dhoruba, what's happening?
Peace, brother. How you doing?
Man, we're live on the Rival. Everything good with you?
Fighting fire with a...
So you fighting fire with a feather?
Sir.
Hey man, I hope you got a pretty large feather, you know what I'm saying? Because it's definitely burning. You know, so first off, you know, we appreciate you coming on anniversary of the Black Panther Party. For those brothers and sisters who are listening via internet, via telephone, via radio, whatever, who may be new to the whole concept or hearing about the Black Panther Party, or who have been misled about what the Black Panther Party was, can you do us a favor and just give us a history of what the Black Panther Party represented and what the Black Panther Party meant to you?
We have to deal with things within the historical context. So the Black Panther Party, to me, represented the integrity of the black community. You know, I was raised in New York, Bronx, and Harlem, so I was accustomed to a type of treatment by the police, and this treatment, you know, gave me a fuller appreciation of the role that law enforcement played in our community, to intimidate, to brutalize us, how this was institutional, and how this was part and policy of the policy of containment, you know, channeling and curtailing black rage and militancy in among youth. So when the Black Panther Party came along and enunciated the concept, idea of self-defense, we had a right to self-defense. All human beings had a right to self-defense, and that we should organize ourselves along those lines and understand the role of violence in the United States. How white supremacy has used violence to terrorize and intimidate us historically, and how it was necessary at that time for us to take a stand. And so, you know, that's what the Black Panther Party meant to me. It meant to assume a struggle for the integrity for ourself, for our self-esteem, our own integrity, and our manhood. As far as my political development as a consequence of that, of course, once you become involved in the struggle, once you become involved in the fight, you realize that it's the fight itself that's important, and that to be involved in the fight itself is absolutely important. And your consciousness and your understanding of a lot of things you're doing will develop. But of course, there's a lot of sacrifice involved. I didn't expect to live this long. I think there's a lot of older revolutionaries who didn't expect to be around this long. And so the downside of that is when you're around too long, you get to see how the forces of reaction consolidated their power and have us once again enthralled in useless endeavors and useless struggles, and reinventing the wheel, so to speak. So it's sad to see the successes of the opposition, but it's heartening now to see that young people are stepping up and trying to take their destiny into their own hands.
Right. Let me ask you this, because of the fact that, again, you know, a lot of youth, more or less, and unfortunately, even some folks who consider themselves elders, they look at the Black Panther Party as some type of nostalgic type situation. You know, just from your experience, you know, you being on the East Coast of the United States, what were some of the programs that the Black Panther Party started, and what were some of the movements that was made, more or less? You know, because oftentimes folks see, you know, the Feed the People program, the Breakfast for Children program. They see, you know, Panthers carrying guns, so on and so forth, marching and rallying. What are some of the other things that, you know, the Black Panther Party brought into existence for folks who may not have a clue as to what the Black Panther Party was about?
Well, one of the things that the party brought into existence was the idea and the concept of decentralization of public safety, and how that was important to understand that we had to control the instruments of public safety, those things that impacted on our daily lives, and that included law enforcement, police, fire, first responders, EMS, emergency medical services, these things that are very important to people who are living in condensed urban populations, urban centers. These services are essential to the health and well-being of inner city communities. And African people, black people in the United States, have no control over these institutions, have no control over the policy or the allocation of funds or of these very vital agencies. And so one of the things the Black Panther Party did in 1968 and 67, 68 was to organize national committees to combat fascism across the United States. Now, these national committees were formations of activists in different cities who felt that they related to the politics of the Black Panther Party, that they understood the situation in more or less the same terms as the Black Panther Party. And they came together to combat fascism, to combat the consolidation of right-wing racist power in the United States that was occurring at that time in 68 and 69. And this right-wing consolidation of racist power and militarism was going on in pursuit of the Vietnam War and in repression of the black nationalists and black rebellions, black nationalist movement and black rebellions across America at that time. So people came together to combat this consolidation between right-wing white supremacy and the police, and the militarized police. And of course, the Black Panther Party was the foremost target of this militarization. In fact, the whole idea and concept of SWAT teams is developed in L.A. Were aimed at suppressing and the Black Panther Party and the Black Underground,
wow,
and containing rebellions in the black community. So SWAT teams and the militarized police we see today have their auspices in the period of 67, 68, and 69, when the Law Enforcement Assistance Association was set up by then President Lyndon Baines Johnson in order to deal with black rebellion. So one of the things that we've learned is that whenever you deal with the police in the black community, you're dealing with an occupying army. You're dealing with a military force. You're dealing with the armed agents of the state. And these armed agents of the state, their role in our community is to control and contain us and to terrorize and intimidate us, and to make sure that we depend completely on them for our safety and well-being. And the Black Panther Party said, well, if that's the case, we should decentralize the police. We should require that these come from our communities, that they live in our communities. We should take control of the command and control structure of the police in our community and determine the policing policies in our community. And this decentralization program, we put to these NCCFs that we had organized around the country, and we proposed decentralization of the police in several major New York cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, I think maybe Chicago, LA, and these campaigns were carried forward with great vigor. And we recruited lawyers, we recruited human rights activists, to work on these programs and get this legislation on the local ballot, on the referendum, by referendum, local ballot, decentralization of the police. And the response that we got was from the police unions. The police unions marshaled all of the political influence and power that they could muster in order to thwart decentralization of the police. And because it was so popular with black people at that time, this idea and concept of the police living amongst them, being responsible to them, because this idea was so popular, the police unions mounted multi-million-dollar campaigns to flip the issue, to flip the script, and transfer or transform demands for decentralization into community review boards.
Right.
And setting up another, a civilian complaint review board to siphon off any legitimate efforts to control the police in the black community. And of course, they recruited the local lackeys and Negroes and preachers in order to do this. And so in New York City, for instance, we got the referendum on the ballot to decentralize the police, and the police union, the PBA, the Police Benevolent Association in New York City, spent over $3 million in mounting a campaign to put posters up in the subways, ads on the TV, so that people would be confused about the issue. And they basically had a poster that said, if you want decentralization, if you mean yes, say no, and if you mean no, say yes. Wow. Say yes for decentralization, say for community control, for the community review board, and no for decentralization. And so it worked. And New York City got a civilian complaint review board. And we see what happened with that. Since then, there's been dozens of murders of black men in New York City. Brutal. The New York City Police Department is one of the most brutal and racist in the country. It pioneered the whole idea and concept of stop and frisk and racial profiling in urban areas. And this is with a civilian complaint review board.
Wow. So basically, you
that's
said
the history,
right. So basically, you saying like you mentioned the whole setup for the SWAT, and you mentioned the civilian review board as being pretty much a pacifist situation to kind of keep the people at bay, more or less. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it was institution. They created an institution so that and funded this institution to siphon off the radical demands of organizations like the Black Panther Party that had traction in the black community,
right? And
that people understood to be reasonable. And this has worked time and time again. I mean, it works internationally. The United States does this. It's done the same thing. It's doing the same thing right now when it creates this coalition to go after ISIL in the Middle East. It creates this bogus institution, this bogus formation, so that the reactionaries can all come together under this umbrella and claim that they're fighting for some type of ideal or some type of principle. And this is the same thing that they did with the Negro Comprador class of the 68 and 69. These Negroes were scared to death of black militancy. They were the ones that were fearful of Malcolm X. They were the ones that wanted to oppose the Black Panther Party publicly, but because the Black Panther Party and radical organizations were popular at that time, they didn't dare oppose them for fear of being labeled Uncle Toms. So they worked secretly with the COINTELPRO operations in the city to undermine organizations like the Black Panther Party, to stop us from putting out breakfast programs in certain places, student unions. Some of the teachers that you have today that's teaching black history in the black history departments collaborated with various COINTELPRO operations to stigmatize the Black Panthers as an organization that was controlled by whites and had white people in it. And these cultural nationalists were running around the campus talking this trash, to the point where when the Black Panther Party wanted to convene a constitutional convention in Washington, D.C., a plenary session on Howard University, the FBI approached the student union there and the faculty there in order to bar the Panthers from using Howard University as the venue. And we wound up using a church, a Glide Memorial Church, I believe. One of them was, another church. in D.C. A multi-denominational church gave us their facilities. So we see that, historically, it's been the black so-called black leadership, the black and mainly the black entrepreneurial class and stakeholders who have been the major recipients of institutional largesses and funding to set up institutions and set up these types of programs that siphon off our rage and render us powerless. And you can see this today. It's the unions that have enforced that have enforced institutional policies that prohibit us from questioning these murderous cops, these cop killers, these murderers of black youth. It's their passages of an enforcement of a policeman bill of rights and intimidation of local elected officials by the police unions that have stopped us from getting justice from these grand juries whenever the police murder us. Why do you think this process takes so long? Why do you think none of these cops are ever brought to book? Why do you think it takes so long for us just to get their names whenever they brutalize and murder us? It's the police union. Wow. It was the police union. That intimidated the Obama Justice Department and Eric Holder to put $1 million bounty on Assata Shakur's head in order to appease law enforcement in the United States as the United States moves towards a rapprochement and accommodations with Cuba and the lifting of the blockade in the future. So we can see that the police unions are the ones that are behind most of the delays in justice and blockading justice whenever these police murder us. And finally, we could see this in the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal just recently. Right. We see now that the Fraternal Order of Police have moved into the state legislature in Pennsylvania to pass a law prohibiting prisoners from broadcasting or being interviewed in prison, and from people who support them and their families from commenting on their cases and their status in the mass media. They're trying to pass a bill to muzzle Mumia Abu-Jamal's prison radio program.
Right, I saw that.
So, and it's the police union.
Right.
It's the police union that writes these letters to the parole board and say that our political prisoners shouldn't be released from prison because of the heinous crimes that they committed, and these families of police officers are without their father and all of this stuff. But they don't tell you that it was the police who were kicking in the doors and murdering the Fred Hamptons and murdering us. They didn't tell you that they were at war with us and that we were at war with them, and that they killed us and they murdered our families and terrorized our families. We don't get that type of equal airtime that the union gets to portray the cops as victims in the 60s rather than aggressors. So it's the police unions that are the real enemy of justice in this state. And we're not just talking about police unions as in terms of patrolmen. We're talking about all of these armed agents of the state have unions. Right. And these unions are very powerful, influential across the board institutionally in America. America's a police state, so the police unions have more power than black people.
Right. In 1969, J. Edgar Hoover said that the Black Panther Party, without question, represents the greatest threat to internal security of the country. And he pledged that in '69 it'd be the last year of the party. And we noticed that same year, Chairman Fred Hampton was murdered out in Chicago, along with Deputy Minister of Defense Mark Clark. And we know that folks like yourself was later captured and charged with the whole situation with the Panther 21. And once you all beat that, you were framed again. For the listeners, you did 19 years as a victim of counterinsurgency, the whole COINTELPRO situation. Can you give us a brief of how that came about, and how did you end up being released after that 19-year piece?
Well, that's a long story, bro.
Now, I mean, well, you know, basically,
That's a long story.
I mean, I guess it's 19 years worth. But I'm saying, like,
But to condense it all, I think many of the listeners who are tuned into the program probably have a basic understanding of COINTELPRO, the FBI's secret counterintelligence program that was carried out in the United States against first the left, the white left, and later on against the black nationalists and Pan-African movements. Of course, the techniques of COINTELPRO, the divide and conquer techniques, the racist disinformation and stigmatizing of black leaders, of course, in the case of African people in the U.S., began ever since Plymouth Rock landed on us. And so a lot of these techniques were developed on the plantation.
Right.
You know, allowing blacks to get together on Sundays to hoop and holler and make sure that the preacher monitored everybody. And anyone that talked about overthrowing Mazza, you understand, the preacher would go snitch on them, and that slave would be sold to another plantation.
Yeah.
You know, these techniques, you know, were all initiated in the course of developing chattel slavery and extermination and the genocide of the native people. But having said that, the actual COINTELPRO counterintelligence program that was aimed at us was a Cold War strategy. It was a strategy designed to contain the domestic colonial status of African people in the U.S. While the United States carried out its empire or wars abroad, mainly in Vietnam, in Korea, before Vietnam, and in the Middle East. All of these contradictions at that time that came about at the end of World War II, when the French and the British and the other colonial powers had lost their empires, and African nationalism was on the rise, Pan-Arabism was on the rise, Islamic resistance to Western institutions was on the rise. This was a very volatile period.
Right.
And so when we look at the counterintelligence program, we have to understand it in this context, that it was a program of war. It was a program of domestic war, a psychological war being waged against the people that the government, and that's us, black folks, the people that the government perceived as subversive threats to the national security state, to the state to the republic. And this is how we have been viewed ever since the Civil War and the end of the Civil War and the reapproachment between the North and South. We have always been viewed as a population that was susceptible to revolutionary ideology from abroad, to revolutionary influences from abroad. We were always treated like children in this respect, like we didn't have an original idea of self-determination on our own, that we didn't have a concept of wanting to control our own destiny, that we had to be influenced from the outside, that we had to be influenced by communism or something like that. But the radical tradition that came all the way from Denmark Vesey, from Sojourner Truth, the radical tradition of Malcolm X, of Marcus Garvey, the radical tradition of black nationalism, or the black pioneers, and of the original Black Panther Party. None of this radicalism was considered by white supremacy as being indigenous or having any type of impact on the masses of black people. It was just race consciousness and race extremists. And by the time the 1960s rolled around, this myth, this perception, this misperception was blown away, especially after Kwame Ture and the brothers and sisters in SNCC at the Pettus Bridge declared Black Power to be the mantra and the slogan with a new age of black militancy and radicalism. And at that point, the United States government realized that what they were dealing with was a homegrown nationalist movement that had an internationalist component, that understood imperialism, that understood class contradictions for the first time, that we understood that, and that the Black Panther Party represented that understanding when it came into existence, because it was one of the first cadre organizations, one of the first organizations that had democratic socialism as its organizing principle and a revolutionary ideology of overthrow of capitalism in the capitalist state. And there had never been a black organization that was like that, and that advocated self-defense, armed self-defense, and that saw a resistance of armed self-defense in proactive terms as well as reactive terms. In other words, we believe that the best offense was a good defense, and that defense also implied that we had to be proactive as well as reactive, and therefore the Black Underground came into existence in organizations and responses like the Black Liberation Army and came into being at that time.
Right on. You're listening to Contraband Classified